Okay, let's restart. Okay, let's reconvene. In the interest of time, we need to keep pushing on. I hope everyone's refreshed and renewed. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for rejoining us. Apparently, we're trending number 2 on Twitter in Brussels, so you're doing fairly well, but you need to do a bit better. Okay. All right. And also, these lights, it's difficult to see hands when they go up in the back. So I will try and make a special extra effort for the questions at the back. But you might need to wave a bit more and make yourself a bit more evident because it is a bit difficult to see. So I apologize if I've missed any questions at the back. And I'll redress that as we go forward. The first of our panels now, having had this strong start with those keynote speeches, and I'm grateful to our keynote speakers. We're going to talk about the future of treating and living with cancer. That's the title of this panel. And as I say, I think we have to look at it's really important to look at the immense progress that has been made while also looking at unmet needs, because we need to reflect upon the positives to show that it is realistic to expect a lot more in future and how much further we can take cancer care in Europe. So the way this is going to work, we're going to have as with all these panels, we're going to set the scene and spell out some facts of the case in terms of the progress and future development in terms of innovation for treating and living with cancer. And then we'll have a discussion with our esteemed panelists. So our panelists will include patient representatives, patient advocates, clinicians, as well as we've got someone from the HIV community, which is great because I think we can learn some lessons. That was an emergency in its time. It's still critically important. And in a way, we're talking about now cancer as a similar epidemiological emergency. So there may be lessons to be drawn from that. So I'm excited about having someone from the HIV community joining us for the panel. But now, the opening presentation then, I'd like to welcome Professor Ahmed Awada, from the Institut Jules Bordet, who will be talking to us about the innovations and progress in cancer care. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Really my great pleasure to be here to discuss this really important advances in oncology. You know, I am a medical oncologist since now 30 years. My main expertise is drug development. I witnessed over 30 years the development of chemotherapeutic agent, targeted therapy, and more recently immunotherapy. And I have really the chance to see over the 30 years of development in cancer therapy, all these new really advances. So when I look to the title of the forum, Towards a New Era in Cancer Care, basically, we are in a new era in cancer care. Already we are. And with the advances, I will show you what we achieved and what we should, let's say, move on in the near future. You can see here my disclosure. OK, let's start with a slide showing cancer patient from prevention to recovery. I didn't put here to death because I think now we have a lot of patients recovering from cancer. And this really is very important. And that is really new because the development of many techniques, molecular biology, new therapies, and so on. But let's start it from prevention. We heard a lot about prevention. Clearly, lifestyle is important. Unfortunately, so far, drugs didn't emerge really well as prevention measure. Screening, we are a little bit moving from mass screening in general. Of course, there are differences between tumor type. But for breast cancer, probably, we are moving, at least in clinical research, from mass screening to targeted screening. Person at risk to develop breast cancer. Diagnosis is moving. It's not simply now histology. Molecular biology is really very important in the diagnosis process. Molecular imaging too. Of course, multidisciplinary approach now is key to have, let's say, cure from cancer and to recover from cancer. Supportive care. Supportive care is not only a story of the end of life and so on. We know today that when we started the first treatment of cancer, even with surgery or radiation or medical oncology treatment, supportive care should be an important part because this influences the survival of our patient. And this was really well explained and reported in lung cancer. Management of toxicities, management of comorbidities, multidisciplinary approach, psychological support and social reintegration and follow-up. Let's move now to the treatment before to go to the innovation. Still, surgery is really important in cancer treatment. Radiation is important in cancer treatment with all the development. Cytotoxic chemotherapy is important, and more recently, molecular target therapy and immunotherapy. Very quickly, the innovation, let's say at the multidisciplinary level, not only medical oncologists, my main expertise. We achieve much more development now with surgery, with robotic surgery, minimal invasive surgery. Radiation is more and more targeted, more active and less toxic, and that's really important. Therapeutic radionuclide is started to be part of our armamentarium. We have the first example, iodine, radioactive iodine for thyroid cancer, but we have a new generation, PSMA for prostate cancer. Chemotherapy is still important, and we have now in our hand in clinical practice and as innovation what's called targeted chemotherapy. And I will give you one example. And of course, the huge development with the development of targeted therapy and immune therapy. This is the new chemotherapy today and for the next 10 to 20 years, what's called antibody-drug conjugate. What's mean antibody-drug conjugate? Take the example of breast cancer, a small group of breast cancer, HER2 disease. Breast cancer with amplification of one protein, one gene called HER2. 15% of breast cancer. We have now a monoclonal antibody changing completely the story of HER2 disease, trastuzumab. What we did here, to put trastuzumab with chemical linker to chemotherapy, to toxic chemotherapy. So the monoclonal antibody here, trastuzumab, is driving toxic chemotherapy specifically, selectively to cancer cell harboring HER2. That means more efficacy and less toxicity or different kind of toxicity. Antibody-drug conjugate, this is one example, and there are many, many examples. This is what's called targeted chemotherapy. This is really innovative chemotherapy. Let's move now a little bit to personalized medicine. Before to go to molecular, let's say, basis of precision medicine, remember that precision medicine started with many things in relation to patient, lifestyle of patient, the age of the patient, gender of the patient, comorbidities of the patient, the metabolic pathway of the patient, the immune function of the patient. So that's before to go to molecular biology. This is also the basis of what's called today personalized medicine, personalized oncology, precision oncology. But of course, we are speaking about precision oncology due to the progress on molecular biology. And you can see on this slide the partner of precision medicine. We are not there completely today. We are at the beginning. What are the partners? The biologists in the lab, developing the hallmark of cancer, the principle of cancer. The people in the lab sequencing our tumor, understanding the biology, the mutational signature of the tumor. Important not to forget the chemist, developing drugs, new drugs, immunotherapeutic agent, targeted therapy, chemotherapy agent, antibody-drug conjugate. The chemists are really important. And finally, clinical researcher, because without clinical trials, without clinical research, we cannot advance. We cannot prove that the new therapy is better than the previous one. In this slide, you can see the hallmark of cancer. This is published in 2011, still alive as hallmark today. I will focus on three of them to give you some three examples. One of the hallmark of cancer, the principle of cancer, the difference between cancer cell and normal cell is that the tumor proliferation, that the tumor escape the immune function. That's a second example I would like to focus. And the third example I would like to focus among 11 hallmark of cancer is angiogenesis. That means the tumor need to develop its bed of vessels to have oxygen and nutrient. example, once back to HER2 disease, very simple example, 15% of breast cancer. HER2 is important in the carcinogenesis process. Of this 15% of breast cancer, we developed so far 3 generations of drugs, trastuzumab the first, pertuzumab second, TDM1, tyrosine kinase inhibitor. We are targeting this receptor, this protein at the membrane level in different epitopes, different sites, and by doing this, we generate more efficacy and we are overcoming the resistance to the first generation and so on. So this is a really good example, 3 generations of a drug to target only one receptor, which changed completely the evolution of HER2 disease. Angiogenesis, tumor angiogenesis, important for the development of cancer. I took the example of renal cell carcinoma. Renal cell carcinoma is very angiogenic tumor, very vascularized tumor. So far, we developed 7 anti-angiogenic agents, which transform completely the prognostic of metastatic renal cell carcinoma. The median survival time was 8 months, and now it's 3 years. And that's before the era of immunotherapy. Of course, immunotherapy helped much more this patient with renal cell carcinoma. And the last revolution, let's say, on cancer therapy is immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is not new. We are looking for immunotherapy since 30 years, and we failed. And when at the time we understand why cancer cells and how cancer cells block the immune function and that the tumor is tolerated at the molecular level, and the chemists developed antibodies targeting this molecule, we achieve a major advances. And we really liberate the immune cells to tackle the cancer cells. And that really was at the basis of a new immunotherapeutic agent with major advances in the treatment of our patient. And you can see here, in 5 to 7 years, many solid tumors, we never thought that in this tumor immunotherapy will be efficacious. Non-small cell lung cancer, melanoma, that's we expect to some extent. Renal cell carcinoma, bladder cancer, head and neck cancer, skin cancer, and many other tumor types, immunotherapy, checkpoint inhibitors, which liberate the immune system to really tackle the cancer cells. We achieve a lot of development and result in this solid tumor, and more to come. We are not at the end of the story, we are in the beginning of the story. And there are now 2nd generation of immunotherapy approach to tackle the resistance to 1st generation. And here, the first monoclonal antibody targeting the immune function and liberating the immune function, and only in melanoma. In melanoma, you know, the median survival time before immunotherapy was 8 to 1 year at the maximum. We have 1 to 2 therapeutic agents which really survive, that the patient survived for 1 year. Now, it's important to know, with 1 monoclonal antibody, 20% of the patients are metastatic melanoma are alive at 10 years. And with anti-PD-1, PD-L1, other checkpoint inhibitor in melanoma, 50% of the patients with metastatic melanoma are alive. 5 years in 50% of the patient, a major advances with immunotherapy. Of course, we should also deal with the toxicity, with the immune toxicity. And as I told earlier, we are not at the end of the story of immunotherapy. There are other innovative approaches. To mention 2 of them, in addition to the combination based on immunotherapy, immunotherapy plus immunotherapy, immunotherapy plus chemotherapy, immunotherapy plus antivascular therapy. But here you can see there are new approaches, oncolytic viruses. We are using viruses to infect the cancer cells specifically and to destroy cancer cells. There are some examples now in clinical research and 1 example in clinical practice. And more recently, the development of CAR therapy, T-cell CAR therapy. What's mean? To take the lymphocyte, the immune cells of the patient, to manipulate these immune cells, to re-administer these immune cells to tackle specific antigen related to cancer. And that's a very good example in leukemia, and we have some example now in clinical trials in solid tumor. I will not enter in details because it's still in clinical research. So I show you some example of innovation on therapy, targeted chemotherapy, radionuclide therapy, immunotherapy, molecular targeted therapy. But also in oncology, it's important to think concept and strategy in treating patient. We improve the outcome of patient not only by therapy, but also by looking to concept, new concept and new strategy. Example of the Minister De Blok mentioned really the NGS, mentioned the gene profiling. What is the consequences of this development? The consequences of this development is to escalate the therapy in some of our patients and to de-escalate the therapy in other patients. And that is really a new concept, a very important concept. Basically, by doing so, we are individualizing the approach and treatment of our patient. And this is a reality due to the progress on technology and so on. Second concept, which is really important, you know, when we have solid cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, we know the patient will not cure from with available therapy today in the metastatic setting. But we are now separating metastatic setting in two groups to some extent. A group what's called with oligometastatic disease. That means 2-3 sites of metastasis, 3-4 small metastases, by opposition to bulk metastasis. And so we are trying, and this is a really new strategy of clinical research, to treat this oligometastatic disease with curative intent. And we start to see in lung cancer an increase in survival by doing so. And how we can treat this oligometastatic lesion? By giving systemic therapy, medical treatment, but also in addition to that, in the metastatic setting, by doing radiation to small lesion, by operating small lesion, and that really something is developing now in the treatment of cancer patient. Third development, Minister De Blok mentioned this, next generation sequencing. Next generation sequencing, that means we are looking to the gene abnormalities on the cancer cells compared to the normal cells. And that's, by doing so, we understand really well the biology of the disease. And the last approach here, concept, what's called organ agnostic therapy. And I will explain to this very quickly. Let's focus now in next generation sequencing, looking to the mutation in cancer cells, looking to the gene abnormalities in cancer cells, translocation, deletion, fusion gene. What's the advantage by doing so? Understand the tumor biology, understanding the evolution of the disease. Cancer is not static, is a dynamic. And more we give therapy, this evolution is more accelerated. So we should follow this in order to tackle the disease, to overcome the resistance, and so on. And next generation sequencing help to understand this evolution and to guide therapy and to arrive what's called personalized medicine, precision medicine, molecular medicine. And one of the consequences of doing NGS, this is an example in common tumor, colon cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer. You can see here melanoma, head and neck cancer. By doing NGS, looking to the mutational signature of this common cancer, we are segmenting this cancer in very small group of tumor with specific molecular abnormalities, which could be targeted differently one group over the others. For example, in non-small cell lung cancer, we have, let's say in Europe, 5 to 7% of patients had mutation in one gene called EGFR. And of course, we have 3 generations of drugs now tackling EGFR. And so this is really developing. The first consequence of NGS is that common tumor will become more a very small group of tumor with a lot of challenges for a clinical research and also for a clinical practice. Here, another example and concept very important, at least started in our, let's say, approach. So we didn't consider the origin of the cancer, but only the abnormalities, the gene abnormality scenes. And here the example of one of the abnormalities seen in many tumor types, but with a frequency from 1% to 13, 14% at the maximum in several solid tumors, including pediatric tumor. And so that means here the origin of the tumor is not important. Colon cancer, lung cancer, whenever, it's not important. What is important here, if this patient had what's called TRK fusion, we have today a molecule called larotrectinib, and larotrectinib gives shrinkage of tumor in all this tumor with this abnormality, TRK fusion gene, in 85% of the patient. So 3 patients out of 4 will respond to this drug if they have this gene fusion independently of the origin of the tumor. And that's also the beginning of a new story in cancer therapy. What's NGS showing us too? We know that hereditary cancer is around 5%, 3 to 6% at the maximum. By doing NGS to the majority of our patients, we are seeing more and more, and we are discovering more and more hereditary cancer, with all the consequences for the patient and all the consequences for the family of the patient. And we should deal as medical oncologists and practitioners with this really emerging field in our clinical practice every day. Of course, to follow this evolution, this biological evolution of a cancer over time, we should do several biopsies for the patient, and this is a very invasive approach. But probably there are one solution for that, what's called liquid biopsy. Instead to do to the tumor and to do biopsy of the tumor on the liver, on the lung, in the bone, the aim is to go to the blood, to take out the blood and to look in the blood the cancer cells, the circulating cancer cell, or the circulating tumor DNA. We know that some of the cancer cells coming from many metastases or from a primary tumor will go to the blood. Could be cancer cells, the whole cancer cells, but could be also the genetic background, the tumor DNA of the cancer cells. And that will facilitate a lot our work to follow this evolution over time from one side, and is much less eventually invasive to the patient. And what is the consequences of this liquid biopsy? We can detect early the cancer. There are some data, early data to support that. Could give prognosis for the patient. The tumor mutational burden, because in some patients we have several mutations. The minimal residual disease after therapy. We can predict response to therapy. We can monitor the treatment to response to treatment, and we can look to the resistance mechanism. So this liquid biopsy is probably one of the major advances in terms to really is touching every setting in cancer. And I think we are working hard, many groups in the world to let's say, to go in this direction in order to facilitate the approach of our patient. Of course, I show you a very positive story in terms of therapy, in terms of concept, in terms of strategy, and so on. But still, there are a lot of challenges. And I would like to summarize it very quickly. Solid cancer, for example, colon cancer, lung cancer, head and neck cancer, melanoma, is not simple disease as you can imagine. Is very heterogeneous disease, and this is really a major problem. We are tackling partially this problem with liquid biopsy, but that is not the end of the story. We give a lot of therapy to our patient today in the metastatic setting and still resist to therapy. Primary resistance, that means they didn't respond at all, or responded and progressed later. Some of the patients will receive this therapy very early, at the time of the diagnosis of the primary tumor. And unfortunately, we know that 30% of our patients, in spite of surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, targeted therapy, immunotherapy, will recur. That means there are resistance to our therapy. So resistance remains a major challenge. The third challenge is to manage our patient in terms of side effect. And the third, we have this problem is emerging in our clinical practice. It is the development of brain met. As you know, brain met is the brain is a sanctuary, that means it's protected by a barrier, and many of our therapy will not go easily, let's say, to the brain. And so we saw more and more brain met in our practice from melanoma, from non-small cell lung cancer, from breast cancer, and even today from solid tumors like colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, because these patients live more than before. This is an example of resistance. You know, melanoma patient received targeted therapy, responded really well, but unfortunately some months later or some years later, the disease will come back because there are a new mechanism developed which are responsible of resistance, and understanding this resistance is really key to develop a new strategy and to improve the outcome of our patient. Unfortunately, there are some tumor types we didn't progress really well. Pancreatic cancer is still a very bad disease, and glioblastoma, that's another tumor type. Unfortunately, we are far from helping our patient. And so we should work hard there to improve this patient. And this is an example of a brain met from many tumor types who are seeing this problem. Even if we are treating this well now with surgery, radiation, radiosurgery, and so on, still the prognosis of this patient is not good. And we are losing some patients with really very good control of the disease elsewhere, but the patient progressed in the brain and died from this disease. And so it's important to work on that. And of course, all this development in terms of therapy, that means we should change a little bit, even deeply, our thinking how to develop all this strategy. The model of clinical research and translational research we are doing is to some extent successful, but not fully successfully. And we should adapt our model of clinical research. And there are some groups now looking how to improve our model of clinical research in order to take into consideration all this development in biology, new therapies, and so on. So let's go to the conclusion, looking to the future. So innovation in science and technology will shape the future, the present, and the future of clinical cancer care, from surgery to supportive care. And supportive care, I insist, should be put it on table with the patient from the beginning, at the time of the diagnosis, not late in the evolution of the disease. I think artificial intelligence, this is a big topic, you know, mean many things, will help in the management of our patient. I think liquid biopsy have the potential to transform early detection, diagnosis, and treatment of cancer. More hereditary or genetic disposition cancer are identified and need a specific approach at all levels, from the therapy and the management to the psychological support. And it is important because many of our patients, fortunately, are cured or alive with disease for a long period of time, and sometimes for years. So how to manage life during and after cancer is really very key, very important and key now to help our patient. And so we are speaking about innovation. Innovation means that we should have access to our patients should have access to innovation. If they cannot have access, still will remain invention. And of course, we spoke this morning about, in spite that the incidence of cancer is increasing, the mortality is decreasing, but hopefully we'll see this decrease much more deep than today. With that, I would like to thank you very much.
On time. On time. Thank you, Ahmed. We're going to move. No, please take a seat because we're going to move on to our panel discussion. I'm going to sit here, so if you just like to move, thank you. We're going to move on to our panel discussion, but I'd just like to thank you for that really excellent and inspiring presentation, which I think sets the scene for our panel discussion. I think you described to us that how you get the sense that we suddenly sort of landed on this undiscovered continent of cancer therapy, and how we're discovering it now very fast, and I guess the promise of that's already been delivered, but what will come in the future in terms of new diagnostics, new therapeutic approaches, better targeting of therapies, and I think a revolution in our basic understanding of the concepts. So not site specific, but defined by the biology. So I think that's very exciting, and I think I'm also glad that you raised the issues about supportive care and about the whole sort of package. Not simply the targeted therapies. And I think those are all issues we want to address. So I'd like to invite up onto our stage to discuss this in a bit more detail. I'd like Antonella Cardone, who's Director of European Cancer Patient Coalition and the board member of Pancreatic Cancer Europe. You mentioned pancreatic cancer in your presentation as an unmet need there. Simon Ekman, Associate Professor and Oncologist at the Karolinska Institute. Mike Holmes, who's Associate Vice President for Global and Medical Affairs Oncology at MSD. And Nikos Dedes, Chair of Positive Voice in Greece. That's I mentioned earlier, hopefully drawing lessons from the HIV experience. So great. We've got a sort of multidisciplinary recommendations from all of you here. And I'd like you all, I guess, I'm going to ask you in turn basically to sort of make some opening remarks. I know some of you have a slide or two as well as part of those. Antonella, I wonder if I could start with you. I think it's important to get the patient perspective on the progress that's been made, but also where you see that there is still work to be done and where the unmet needs are.
Yeah. Thank you. So one of our major concerns and priority is on survivorship. Of course, survivorship wouldn't be an issue if we did not have, if we did not prioritize on innovative treatments. So thanks to the fact that we have new, more and more impactful treatments, we have an increased number of people surviving cancer. And this number is due to increase due to the fact that cancer is also linked to the aging population, and we know that in Europe the population is aging fast. So this 14 million of cancer survivors today this number is going to increase, and so survivorship cannot be ignored. And still there is a huge lack of attention to survivorship care at European level. What does survivorship mean for cancer patients? So cancer patients, when surviving cancer, they are facing two fronts. Their struggle is on two fronts. One front is the clinical side, and the other front is societal aspects. On the clinical side, cancer survivors are facing cancer and cancer treatment complications. Today, there are almost up to 90% of cancer patients face a comorbid condition throughout their survivorship life. And cancer patients are more likely to report a comorbidity compared to any other patient who doesn't have a history of cancer. Just to give you some examples of the major cancer treatment complications. A patient can survive cancer, but then can die of heart failure. So cancer is associated with some complications. So cardiovascular conditions, cancer-associated thrombosis, or neurological complications. Urological complications can occur due to, for instance, impotence for men or incontinence. Then there could be nutrition aspects or fatigue, pain, which are complications of a patient cured of cancer. But then, on the other side, there are also societal aspects, societal challenges that cancer survivors have to face. Cancer is still a stigma. So as we heard before, there are discriminations against cancer survivors. One being the fact that they struggle to maintain their work, or they face difficulties to return to work. And also they have to face barriers when accessing a mortgage or an insurance. So the financial toxicity also cannot be ignored. So some of the main challenges that we are facing when it comes to survivorship are linked to screening and lack of integrated care, and there is still a lack of research and data. Then just a few words on pancreatic cancer, because I'm also, as Vivek said, I'm also on the board of Pancreatic Cancer Europe. Pancreatic cancer is a rare cancer, and it is one of these cancers that is still deadly. It's a deadly kind of cancer. And one of the reasons why it is the death rate is so high is due to the fact that it is not detected on time. So when pancreatic cancer is detected, unfortunately, in most of the cases, it's already metastatic. So with Pancreatic Cancer Europe, we would really like to raise awareness on pancreatic cancer among policymakers, so on the possibility to maybe have screening for the high-risk population or identify new treatment through prioritizing on research. And then raising awareness among healthcare providers and patients on the issue.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Simon, as a clinician, maybe, please open with whatever you wish, but I would be interested to hear what you have to say about survivorship and maybe for these diseases like pancreatic cancer where the therapy is not quite there yet, but there may be other things that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is, as alluded very nicely by Professor Wada, to move more into precision cancer medicine. That means to do more extensive testing, related to that, more clinical trials, better diagnostic tools, and to learn more about, for example, pancreatic cancer. In some disease areas, we have moved more quickly, like melanoma, lung cancer. We have new targeted therapies, and those could really lead the way. But I think, as you referred to, it's tumor agnostic. So as a principle, we should follow this path that it could work in many different cancer types. Immunotherapy being one good example. And hopefully, but it's also, as alluded to, tumors are heterogeneous, and we need to understand much more about tumor biology. So it's very complex diseases, and research has to be ongoing. So from a clinical perspective also, you're absolutely right. Patients are living longer and longer, and sometimes with longer and longer treatment periods, so patients do suffer from side effects. Some take a tablet each day during several years, and even as a minor side effect could be quite burdensome during that period. So it's important also not only to look at the effect of treatments, but also the side effects. How can we develop better treatments to reduce the side effects? One other thing I would like to point out is really data, to learn from data, from patient-reported outcome measure, from cancer registers. This is both on an individual level and the population level, to learn more about our treatments in the real world. A minority of the patients are included in clinical trials, and we don't really know often how it really works in daily practice. So to have better follow-up data through registries, patient reports, is very important. And there I would like to add the digital solutions that we need to find, because it's quite burdensome for a healthcare worker to report these data manually. So we need better automatic transfer to get a better and more complete follow-up data. I also would like to stress, before getting cancer, we need to spend a lot on prevention and early detection. And all stakeholders should be involved there. There are obvious benefits of preventing up to, as you heard, up to 40–50% of cancers could be prevented or could be also diagnosed at an early stage with the improvement of prognosis. And some tumor types have already started, breast cancer, but lung cancer, which I'm very active in as a clinician, we are moving now into screening programs, and studies show that we can reduce mortality, lung cancer mortality, up to 20–25% in high-risk groups. So I think that those are, it's very overlapping. If you're a patient advocate, if you're a clinician, from the industry, politicians, I think we have these common grounds. We just need to work together in a better way, and the European Union is a very good opportunity to do that. So, but I'm very optimistic. Going back to your nice Professor Awada's presentation, the future is already here, but we need to improve all the time, and it's very complex situation. So never rest, but I'm optimistic. Yeah.
Good. Well, I mean, I can discern from that, and I think we're going to discern from that. So maybe some policy asks from the Commission and from the action plan. And I will come back to those because we're going to formulate these questions back to you in a poll like we had the first time, and we'll try and get some prioritization of some of the issues that you raised. But we'll come back to that. Michael, I think it'd be good also now to hear from industry what your response is to what you've heard, and what's the kind of commitment that might be there to ensure continued progress, but also ensure that the progress we have is more evenly distributed.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity. So I think the first thing that I would like to say is that we are living through a revolution. I think, Professor, we heard you very nicely explaining how cancer treatment is progressing at a tremendous rate, and certainly from the perspective of the immune oncology therapies which we've seen developed in the last 10 years and becoming available in the last 5 years. We've seen great changes for certain cancers for survivorship, and we certainly have to think about cancer survivors as well, as we've heard. And certainly, for example, with melanoma, we're now seeing 5-year data, and we're seeing 30 to 40% of patients, up to 40 or even 50% of patients with melanoma are still alive at 5 years. We're seeing overall survival numbers of around 35 months for melanoma, which is extraordinary when you consider where we started with melanoma, where perhaps the survivorship or the overall survival was counted in months, certainly rather than years. And the same with lung cancer. We're seeing 5-year data with lung cancer as well, where we're seeing overall survival figures of 22 months. And we're seeing up to a quarter of patients still alive, whereas in the previous era of chemotherapy, even with the doublet chemotherapy, patients were perhaps surviving 6 to 9 months. So I think for us in industry, it's very exciting to be part of those developments. But also, and I think we've already heard quite a lot about this morning, it's very important that we don't work in isolation. We need to work in partnership. We need to work with of course, with our regulators, with the European Medicines Agency. We need to work very closely with the reimbursement authorities across Europe. We need to work very closely with patient groups, of course, because in the end, the patients are the ones who tell us what it's like to have cancer and what it's like to experience treatments. I think that that's something very, very important. And we as a company are very much committed to that type of multi-stakeholder interaction and that kind of partnership that we would like to have, rather than just working purely in a kind of a silo. So for us, that is very important. And although we are certainly very pleased with the progress that we've made. We're not satisfied yet. There's still a long way to go. There are still patients who don't respond to the immune checkpoint inhibitors. And we, as a company, are investing a tremendous amount in future innovation as well. We're investigating in over 30 tumor types. We have over 1,000 trials just in the immune oncology space. But we have a very rich pipeline looking at a number of different technologies. We heard about some of these upcoming technologies during the keynote. And that's something that we as a company are very much dedicated to. I think also very important is to understand the tumor. The biology is very complex. And the more that we study tumors, then the more that we engage in R&D, and we do have failures, of course. Not every one of our trials is successful. But we always try, particularly I think as MSD, we very much focus on trying to understand the tumor biology. That's so important because if you don't understand the tumor biology, it's easy to fail. I've been in the industry over 20 years. I was in clinical practice 10 years before that. And I've seen, during my career, I've unfortunately worked on some compounds which have really failed. But we have to learn. Whenever we have a failure, we have to learn. And we have to learn more about the enemy, which is cancer. We have to learn more about the tumor biology. So that's all the sort of scientific side and the R&D side, which we have a strong commitment to continuing to work in. But of course, reimbursement is another area which is tremendously important for us to be able to work with reimbursement authorities to use innovative ways to improve access for patients. I think that's something which we as a company have invested a lot of time and effort to work at the policy level. We need to be having these discussions even at the European Commission level. It's important that we take part because there has to be a big societal debate about all of this because it's a huge problem, as we've heard, and of course prevention is one end of it, and we're working at the other end, I would say. So I think my final, as from the opening comments, my final remark really would be that the innovation is exciting, but the innovation is nothing without access. We can invent tremendously exciting new compounds and understand molecules and biomarker testing, but if the patients can't get access, then all of that effort is lost and wasted, and it's very important that we work to really maximize patient access.
Thank you. Nikos, can I ask you, I mean, you've listened to all of this. Are there parallels with what happened in the 80s, 90s, and noughties with HIV and the kind of mobilization of the patient communities and the scientific, all of that to not only invent, but to grant access and effectively to eradicate what could have been a pandemic that, well, it was for a while, but yeah. So are there lessons that we can learn from that emergency and apply it in this circumstance?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'm very happy to be here because whenever I have attended meetings and conferences of other disease areas, one can readily identify all the opportunities for us to work more closely together. And in the slide that I have in front of you, what you see depicted there in 5 years intervals is the FDA-approved products in the HIV field in the last 35 years, which more or less coincides very much in the period you were describing, Professor. And what we see there is 55 drugs, well, 55 products, and 33 of them are unique compounds, and 23 are fixed-dose combinations. 7 unique classes of mechanism of actions. So what was it that contributed to all of that? And I have 10 points to make. 8 refer to the history and 2 of my for the future. First of all, there was a huge societal community and clinicians, academics mobilization, which contributed to what we have seen. Of course, it required to be linked with incentives for investment in research. And on one side, we had the National Institute of Health, which was not necessarily prone to do that unless there was a pressure, coming also from the people living with HIV, but also from activists, researchers, and of course also the private sector. So we see that a synergy between these two can have huge impact. The other thing that was required was regulatory innovation. It was a period when it took too much time to develop drugs, and at that time it was necessary to substitute clinical endpoints with surrogate markers. In any case, it's important that we have a constant dialogue, either making sure that the regulatory pathway can facilitate and help. Sometimes we have to make sure that it produces the right data that we want. You mentioned patient-reported outcomes. This is a new frontier where we want to have innovation and participation. What happened in this template is that since 1997, I was diagnosed 25 years ago, so it was still a terminal disease. So pretty much similar situations, but then it was turned into a chronic condition. We went from survival to requesting quality of life. And I saw that in the polling earlier today, the long-term quality of life was still quite low as a priority. It was the one but last. But surely enough, very soon, we will be pursuing the same thing. The other thing that it's interesting in this history is the seminal point of the creation of a fixed-dose combination of one pill once a day, which also reflected a collaboration between 3 different companies. So once again, and going forward for what we will be needing in cancer, as I understand from hearing from experts, there needs to be much more collaboration across companies and disciplines, as you mentioned, and this has already happened. And what we have now as a frontier in HIV, which was mentioned both by Antonella and Simon, is the comorbidities and all the problems that we will be facing and we are facing because we live longer. One of the things that we found as very of critical importance in the HIV field now is mental health. And then, of course, is exacerbated by the various social determinants that Antonella, you mentioned, that impact the lives of people, both increasing vulnerability in order to either develop cancer or indeed get exposed to HIV, and then subsequently how the system allows you to so we see how social determinants are important. And finally, the one huge innovation we have had in the HIV field is the need for global access to life-saving treatment. And Merck was one of the companies who pioneered this at the global level in HIV, making sure that the drugs were available in the world. So alongside of what other speakers have said is, what I think we need is a multi-sectoral collaboration, which includes, of course, the researchers, the academics, the patient organizations, the advocacy groups, in order to be able to focus on outcomes and systems performance. We all know that 25% of healthcare expenditure is a waste. We might just as well start there and make sure that we use all of that to invest. And the second is, I think that we are ready to have this cross-disease collaboration. You mentioned how for cancer survivors, comorbidity is so much more frequent than the others, but the same is true for people who live with HIV. So we will be walking together in the future, and we will be learning more from each other.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Ahmed, if I may, I would like to ask open this to the floor, and I think you'll have an opportunity to respond. So do we have any, I mean, bearing in mind, we've got a panel next on access, so that we'll be focusing in some detail on access to these innovative treatments. But you know, looking at the progress we've made and the policy issues that have been opened up in terms of unmet needs, just to review a few, and you don't have to limit your questions to these, but we had about survivorship care, survivorship, dealing with comorbidities and stigma, which still exist. Of course, the unaddressed diseases, the diseases that are falling behind, like pancreatic cancer. Data and digital solutions that will support that, patient-reported outcomes, prevention and early detection and screening. Sort of, is there a need for mandated multi-stakeholder collaboration, or at least encouraged multi-stakeholder collaboration as part of the drive towards better cancer care, trial access, enhanced support for R&D, and cross-disease collaboration, because many of the issues, particularly around survivorship and quality of life, will be cross disease. So those are the kinds of issues that we've opened up. But over to you for questions. And if you don't have any, don't worry, I'll keep asking them. But yes, yes, over here. And any at the back, please wave. Okay, yes, we've got one. That's the gentleman that I didn't give time to before. So if you don't mind, I'd like to, yeah, thank you.
I'm Guy Stormer from representing OACI. So my question is that you give a beautiful overview. One thing was, according to me, a little bit lacking, is that the impact of bacteria on outcome in cancer. It was a very nice paper 2 years ago on colon cancer, where you have a certain strain of bacteria in the intestine, and the other have another strain. Those who have the first died, they didn't survive. So I think the impact of bacteria on tumor behavior will be very important.
This sounds like a question for our clinicians about...
Really very,
Did everyone hear that question? Sorry. Yeah. Do you want to repeat it, the question?
The question is about the role of microbiome and the intestinal flora and relation to tumor, to response to therapy, and so on. This is really an emerging field and mainly emerged after the administration of immunotherapy to our patient. And we saw there are some reports, even still small and preliminary, that the microbiome of the intestine could influence the response to therapy, to immunotherapy in particular. So I think we need a little bit more insight on that, more data. But I should admit the translational research on this topic is very complicated because it's not easy matter, but clearly there are some influence. And I agree we should not neglect this aspect. And if you and I think we are speaking about precision medicine oncology. This could be one of the, let's say, a factor influencing behavior of the tumor as well the therapy response to therapy.
And if I may just also comment, this is something that we as a company, we're actually, one of our studies, we're looking at the influence of microbiome, both on efficacy, so on the effectiveness of the drug, but also on adverse events and whether patients with different microbiomes may have different impact of the drug, and that's something that we're actually studying in quite some detail in one of our trials. I think you're absolutely right, Professor. It's very early days. It's a really unknown area, but it's fascinating, I think.
Because we are sure that there is an impact on immunity, since patients who has a facial transplantation in Crohn's disease, 50% of them are cured. So perhaps we should look more in detail to that.
Yes, Simon, you want to respond?
Yes, yes. So I think there is a lot of focus on the tumor, the actual tumor biology. But at least as important is to focus on the patient, the host in biological terms. You know, how do a patient respond? You know, we metabolize treatments, drugs differently. We respond differently, including the microbiome. So we really need to understand more. And that also relates to side effects. We react quite differently. So that is an important research area as well.
Okay. So, Madam, you had a question here.
Thank you so much for these really insightful presentations, Laura Batchelor from FIPRA International. I had a question coming back to what you were saying about learnings and working with stakeholders, because no one can do this alone. And to the question of data, because actually we have so much data sitting in silos, be it with the public health authorities, the ministries, the insurers, and then we have the competitive landscape with the innovative pharmaceutical industry. So a question is, how do you see we can sort of break down those silos? A question, I suppose, firstly, is in terms of companies, can we get companies, because you're ultimately all aiming for the same endpoint for the patients, but all doing it in a competitive landscape, so it's challenging. But is there a place where we can get to, though, where you're actually working together to collect the data so we can look at those patient outcomes in a more holistic way to get to solutions quicker? And do you think also it's conceivable that the public authorities can also start working in this open space, so insurers start sharing that data? Because it seems until we start that paradigm shift of sharing that data, getting to an outcome, better outcomes, is going to be slower.
Okay. So I think a lot of you wanted to come in, so I'm going to try and manage this then. Let's start with Mike, and then Ahmed, and then Nikos. Yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, I think that's a tremendously interesting point. the concept of anonymizing, because we have huge numbers of data points. Some of our trials have probably millions of individual data points. The concept of anonymizing them and making them available widely is a good concept. But I know that when I was working in a previous company that we did try to do that, but the practicalities of it were problematic and it needs more work. In the future, we definitely would like to get towards that. But if you allow a large amount of data to become available to all, there has to be some kind of oversight of how the data are used, because it could be somebody could take the data and draw an incorrect conclusion. So I like the principle, but I think we need a lot more work on a framework that would make it so that we don't want harmful conclusions to be drawn from large data sets. So like the concept, but we need more work, I think would be my immediate response.
I think really you ask very important question, and even with many a big influence for a clinical practice. And I will take one example. When we give immunotherapy, we don't know exactly what is the duration of immunotherapy. For example, this is a very important question. And second question, in patients we stop for toxicity, when we challenge what will be the efficacy. So within one company, for example, MSD, I'm sure they have, through all the clinical trial, let's say, a lot of information. So to answer this question, we cannot do clinical trials. It's really big trials, difficult to repeat and so on. But if we take all this data together and eventually collaboration between pharma, we can answer this question of duration, rechallenge therapy, and so on. So this is really very important, even for clinical practice, because we cannot do clinical trials for every setting we need in clinical practice. And these questions are really key for our patient.
Nikos, I hope you're giving us a gift-wrapped answer from each other.
Well, what I wanted to suggest is that we, patients and citizens, need to take some leadership on that, because all of the data that is being generated and sitting and owned by different sectors, in reality, also is co-owned by the people who have contributed to all of this data. We forget that. I remember there was all this issue about reconsenting for huge cohorts and all of this data, and or how can we have access to people who have died. I mean, it was a huge moral issue. But of course, there are huge concerns, and Mike mentioned a couple. So I think that once again, cross-sectoral discussion on that should, and I know it has been going on, both because of data that exists, but also because of the generation of big data, which is now the interest of so many sectors of the IT. So I think that a lot of answers would be lying there. So we need to be proactive in making sure how we anonymize the data and how there is a mechanism to respond to anyone who makes a claim. This has been discussed at the European Medicines Agency, where on the one hand we want to have access to all data. On the other hand, we must be able to protect public interests.
I mean, I'm assuming this is one of those areas where this is a multi-disease issue to some extent, isn't it? Right.
100%.
So another. So Antonella.
Well, yeah, it is a multi-disease issue, but it is also probably a place where the European Commission has a role to play in setting up policies, transparency in the usage of this data. So this is also a message for the European Commission to start developing clear policies on how to collect, anonymize, and how to share, how to make this data available. Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions? We've got one at the front, but I just want to check there's anyone at the back, which is harder to see. No. Okay, we're at two at the front. So yeah, and yeah.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I would like to ask probably Nikos, but also coming from the other presenters. One of the reasons of huge success for HIV was that the total budget for HIV was separated from the total health budget for other diseases. Mm-hmm. If we can recognize that cancer is like an epidemic, 1 out of 3 patients, could you foresee that such a model separating cancer health budget from the total health budget could be a good model?
Okay, there's a question.
Yes, well,
Did everyone hear that question?
I can read. So the question was whether the fact that there was at a certain times HIV-specific budget across both research and also in healthcare delivery, would that help? Actually, this has been one of the issues for which HIV has received a lot of criticism. And unless we ensure that any kind of vertical program and intervention helps health systems strengthening, if we're to speak about Africa, for example, it can no longer fly. I think that it is important to integrate these things. I didn't have a chance to say in my opening remarks how the research on HIV contributed to understanding of immunology, which is now so critical in response to cancer, contributed. Of course, there were many other disease areas or even technologies like PCR. But I think that learning from the examples of the past, I think we must go in a much more integrated approach and identify the horizontal opportunities, starting from research all the way to healthcare delivery. I mean, you know, you mentioned HTAs were mentioned. We cannot do this with a budget for any one disease area. We have to do DALIs and QALIs. We have to find instruments to horizontalize.
Okay, that's interesting.
I think.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I'm wrong.
I mean, maybe that's something we could add to the Slido slides, just to see what the delegates think about, the audience thinks about a specifically appropriated budget for cancer, because there are obviously pros and cons. But yeah, over to the panel. Do you agree, disagree?
I also agree. I mean, coming from the patient, the cancer patient's perspective, it doesn't look opportunistic, but it is the only way to go. We speak about avoiding silos, breaking down the silos. Then we definitely should not develop a silos on a dedicated budget to cancer. Although, I mean, cancer is a priority, and this is obvious. Now it is a priority. But then we should also avoid the development of, now I hear more and more the word of cardio-oncology epidemic, for instance. So this is something that we should definitely avoid and learn from the lessons of HIV.
So I totally agree. I think we need a holistic view. So in Sweden, we have had a national cancer plan for 10 years now. The problem has been that other diseases are a bit put aside because this was a huge effort, more patients diagnosed faster, and that meant more burden on radiological departments, pathology, and that was somewhat at a cost for other diseases. So you really need to have the whole view of the health burden in different countries. So not just separate them, as you say. Yeah.
There was another question, Madam. Do you have a... Yeah. I think do you have a question, or have I just?
I had a comment because do we know
the microphone? Yeah. And press the talk button. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Great.
Do you know the Count Me In project, where patients put their own medical records in a greater plan? And there is also a CBio portal where you can put all your genetic profile, all the medical records as a patient in. So patients want it. Let's bring it on.
Yeah. So patients driving the agenda in terms of...
Yeah, well, we are now very impactful with the European Commission and the European Parliament at European level. For instance, we have met with the Commissioner last Monday, and we are also working with the European Parliament, and we are supporting the development of an intergroup, a parliamentary intergroup on cancer. So.
What's your experience in terms of, I mean, was it the same sort of issues in terms of data sharing roughly, or was it, and what was the role of
Well, many
advocacy?
of these initiatives have been undertaken by groups which like to facilitate faster recruitment for clinical trials. The word that you used, opportunistic, is also a part of that. I'm not sure that it is truly driven by patient organizations, but more by other. I mean, in the rare disease areas, absolutely. There's no question that their registries which were created by the patients were extremely helpful. But when we go to other disease areas, I'm not sure that this has happened at our initiative. But again, you know, private sector will pursue things like that. They have to be regulated. And they have to be utilized. We cannot say no to the new IT and its impact, so we have to embrace it.
Now, we have about 3 minutes before we would do our next audience poll. So are there any other questions that you want to raise at this point?
If I could.
Yeah.
I think that's, now we spoke about segmentation of common tumor. We will become a smaller group of tumors.
Yes.
If we are willing to do clinical research with this smaller group of, so that's mean we should do it in whole Europe and even outside Europe. What is, of course, the registry of patient is really important, the file and so on. But what is really a big problem today to go in this direction, that the patient, when he moves from one country, European country, to another European country, the insurance, they say the health system is not covering this patient. And I think, in my opinion, this is a really very emergent, very urgent matter to deal with and to facilitate that the patient could move from one country to another country to enter in clinical trial, which, let's say, could go with the gene abnormality he has. So this really, for me, is a major issue today, and we should really very quickly look to that.
Yes, I mean, we need to change the geography of centers of excellence in all our countries. And once we go to conditions or indeed tumors which become more rare, then we have to do this collaboration amongst countries. So you're absolutely right. We have to, but we haven't been doing this well enough on all diseases. I'm sure in Belgium as well. So that is, again, I think that we should review all of this because it's this health system performance. How can we optimize resources?
And I think it's a really good point because as tumours become increasingly rare because of segmentation, and I think an example of some good work which has been done is in sarcoma. And I think there were some great efforts, and there was a position paper published by some of the sarcoma leaders, it must be around 7 or 8 years ago, about rare tumours and about how we can effectively study rare tumours, how industry can be involved in that as well, because the rare tumours are just as important as the common tumours, and tumours are getting rarer by default. So, you know, it's something we should all talk about. It's very important.
Okay. I think we should probably just move on to the poll now if it's ready. Do you want to just ask my colleagues to put up the polling question? So you remember how to use the Slido interface. So if you haven't already, just join up and put the hashtag in. And we've sort of formulated these on the hoof from the discussions that we've had. And I'd like you to don't just feel you have to give one answer. I think we're allowing you up to 3 to prioritize your top 3 recommendations for the European Beating Cancer Plan. You can read them all there. I won't have to read them out, but please start voting, and we'll see it in real time, and then we'll reflect on it in the panel. So are people going to vote? Good. Excellent. I'm going to wait. Last time we had about 70 or 80 before it sort of tailed off, so I'm going to just give it a bit of time. We should be taking bets.
Yeah. Should be blinded at first.
Yes, of course. All right, we're beginning to stabilize, I think. So I think we can probably start to discuss now where we're at. So the winner, roughly speaking, slightly, is multi-stakeholder collaboration. Down at the bottom, interestingly, is the issue of comorbidities, which maybe tallies with the fact that survivorship was quite low down in the first poll. It's interesting. And in the middle, we've got fairly high the facilitate the R&D, the actual science and the development, and creating the EU. So that, again, an emphasis on data. So there is a lot of consistency between this and the previous poll, actually. And where's the question we asked about funding, the dedicated funding?
29%.
29%, right. Okay, there we go. Right. So that's sort of lower down. Okay, so any reflections on that from our panel? I think you'd probably agree with that, but I'm interested in why and the comorbidities being really low, actually, and the survivorship. What would you say to that, Antonella?
Well, my first comment on that is that comorbidities are not tackled as a priority, as the first worry, the first consideration is to cure cancer. So access, innovative treatment is fundamental, but then then comorbidities come with time after cancer. We tend to think that it is an issue to tackle later. So first, the first priority is to tackle the disease, cancer. And I also think that this was the reason why survivorship in the previous poll was down, because the first thing is the first priority is to create survivors. Then, we think that it is not the priority now, as still cancer needs innovative treatments, needs to be tackled from a medical point of view as a disease on its own. I think that this might be the reason.
Mm-hmm. So I know others, you want to, Nikos, did you want to say something?
Well, yes,
Ahmed, then Simon?
Yeah. I mean, it is clear first we have to survive, but then we have to plan for success. Because once, and increasingly, the more successful all treatments are, then immediately these other issues will kick in. And then we mentioned we have an aging population. So this is a huge challenge for Europe at large. We need to have more new disciplines. Specialization was critical to achieve all these results. But now, with all the people from 70 or 65 plus, they will have a lot of comorbidities. So, I mean, it reflects success. So it will be coming more and more. And imagine, it is already a problem for people living with HIV, which is a small segment of the population. And there are not enough people to navigate that. Imagine what will happen when we're talking about the 30 and the 40% of the population, or everyone.
And I think as we're now able to follow up patients longer. And we're seeing patients who are now being treated 5 years ago or 6 years ago or 7 years ago, and we're still following those patients to see what their outcomes are. Yeah. And we'll need to learn what the long-term outcomes are for those patients. And that, it's something that's important, I think, for everybody.
And yeah, I think the problem of survivorship is not a new concept. It is since a long time, but we didn't advance well in managing this concept because there's a wide range of intervention. Because survivorship, and comorbidities and so on, is a wide range of intervention. And for each patient, they have specific demand, And what I think it's important to study this question of survivorship like we are studying any scientific question in order to answer carefully. Yeah. I give an example. The patient who survive cancer less than 40 years old, for example, are not the same than patients who survive cancer more than 60 years old. There are some medical complication, but at the social level, psychological level, these patients are completely different. Patients with germinal cancer, for example, who survive still going to school, to university, looking for a job. For people, for example, who develop cancer at 60 years old and more, there's another question. So it's important also to individualize this approach by, let's say, probably 3 groups of patients and to because there are specific problems.
Some,
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think in the cancer field, we are not used to think about survivorship so as much as you have led the way here. So I think the answers here really reflects that we're fighting for survival. That's the number one. And then, but then as important to learn, you know, about survivorships, what are the comorbidities and long-term side effects, but we're just moving into that area, and how to collect that data, you know, from the patients. That's also a new field of. Although I think, you know, also the first response, we feel that I think we can say that very good work is being done, but a bit in silos. So that's reflected in this answer. We need to come together because. You know, then we get stronger.
Another thing strikes me about these results, going on slightly different topic, is the separation between the facilitation of treatment, of R&D and treatment, which is at 49%, and the facilitation of R&D in diagnostics and detection at 39%. Now, it seems to me those two are inextricably linked, especially in the era of personalized medicine. First of all, you detect earlier, you treat better, and also you need diagnostic techniques to triage patients into appropriate therapy. So, I mean, do you have a reflection on the separation between those two, and perhaps that the understanding that those two are not really separable?
I think they're part of the same.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the questions are separated just so that you
Yeah,
can have
I mean,
questions,
that's-
but they're actually part of the same issue. And certainly for us as a company, we've put a lot of focus on the diagnostic side. And been able to better identify patients who will benefit from the drugs, and with our PD-L1 testing and other things that we're doing, and you know, the hope is that we can move towards the blood-based biopsies in the future, which is much better for the patient, and we can then do serial biopsies of blood without having to trouble the patient having to have an actual biopsy. So I think certainly as a company, it's something we're very enthusiastic about, the biomarker side and the next generation sequencing and all of these techniques, and we put them in our trials. We want to find patients who will benefit because that's good for everybody to go that direction.
A question to the floor. I see that question we added about dedicated EU budget for cancer, which garnered 28. Right, these percentages obviously don't add up to 100 because people choose more than one answer. But anyways, low down the list. I wonder if there's someone who argued for it and there's someone who argued against it or voted against it who's willing to kind of describe their rationale, either for or against. Anyone brave? Okay, Mary, go on.
I'm really intrigued by the result there because I voted for it. Because as Bjarke van Dam has said many times, a plan without a dedicated source of funding is simply a dream.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anyone who voted against it who wants to respond to that? I mean, Nikos, you were arguing against.
Yeah, well, can I say something? I mean, I was thinking constantly on this issue. Even in companies, resource allocations is very highly competitive. And in academia, similarly. So actually, we want, on one hand, to promote innovation and even competitiveness in its good way. But at the same time, there has to be a thinking intellect further up to connect the dots. That's all. I mean, if we're talking immunology, we'll give the answer to precision medicine in cancer. How is that cancer-only issue? So it requires also really visionary researchers and academics, politicians, industry, patients, who can actually, we want both somehow. Yes, we want dedicated money so that we can, but it's...
Yeah, but I also don't want to be misunderstood.
Yeah.
So for me, the cancer plan must have a budget, of course. I mean, to me, that is the... you're right. What would be the purpose of a plan without a budget? My point was not to have a dedicated budget to cancer as an individual, independent, isolated disease. So the cancer plan is not only about cancer, about the disease, but about the treatment to the disease. It's also, the cancer plan is also going to tackle comorbidities, survivorship, so all the rehabilitation of cancer survivors from an holistic point of view. So the center should be the person, the patient, not the disease. So, I mean, so it's not, I want to make sure that you get me right. So the cancer plan, yes, of course, must have a budget. I would not consider cancer as an isolated disease.
So could a recommendation be that, there may be a dedicated budget for cancer because it's a good way of garnering funds, but that it is mandatory that the plan is explicit that what it's doing is health system strengthening, as part of its remit is health system strengthening, goes beyond cancer, even though the budget may be for the plan. Is that a way of sort of squaring the circle and a compromise solution, the best of both worlds?
Well, in 2:45 minutes remaining, I think it is one of those things we have to circle the square or square the circle. I mean, it does require a little bit of innovative thinking because, as I said, in the past, certainly HIV received a lot of criticism of having disproportionate resources. Certainly, cancer can never be accused of that, being so big. But we have to find a way to do that.
Yannis, you raised the question. Is there anything you want to say on this? Nope. Okay. Fine. All right. Okay. Is there any other reflections we have on this scoreboard here? The data space. I mean, that's clearly an important issue. Anyone from the floor want to reflect on anything that's been? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Elias Kontouris. I'm coming from MSD Greece. I think because you said who is in favor of EU budget and who is against it. I'm not against it per se, but I think that each member state has to devote some budget on it. I mean, we heard from Mr. Bloch on the Pact for the Future, and this is a magnificent initiative taking place here in Belgium. But, for example, in Greece, we don't have the same thing, and also we need to take special attention to the budget headroom needed for the future to come, all these advancements in oncology. Also, it comes down to the member state because related to comorbidities, and actually this is kind of a question to the panel, it seems to me that primary care needs to play a more important role. I mean, I come from a country that primary care is not well established compared to the UK or Sweden or any other European country. So it seems to me that the primary care should take an advanced role on the comorbidities for HIV patients, for cancer survivors, for this type of people that are in a sense, they're no longer a patient, or they do not feel like a patient, and they just need monitoring. So I would like to hear the panelists, what they think about this. Thank you.
Sure. So we have about, miraculously, three minutes disappeared from somewhere, but yes.
Thank you. That's a very important issue. I think it partly depends on the healthcare system in different countries. So, someone needs to follow up the patients. It could be the primary healthcare, and that's, I think, a good solution because the hospitals are really also burdened by, treating patients and the issues around that. So, once the treatment stops, you go into follow-up and rehabilitation, and I think the primary healthcare is very well suited. Also taking into account comorbidities, as a general practitioner, you have a good view of that. So certainly I think some resources in cancer should be allocated to that. Also on the early detection, early signs of disease. So in both spectra. Yeah.
Well, also multidisciplinary clinics for overall rehabilitation of cancer patients should be ideally implemented. Now, of course, they come with huge costs. and most of the countries are not ready yet, but ideally that is the way to go for multidisciplinary rehabilitation clinics, where all aspects are tackled, not only the medical aspects, the psychological and social reintegration and rehabilitation of cancer patients should be tackled there. So this is why silos budget would not work. We need to make sure that the cancer plan tackles health, economic, social aspects around around cancer, but not only one disease, one isolated budget. Of course, I don't have a solution on this, because, for instance, the investment in this case is made by the health system. So both at European and the country level. So the health system puts the money into it, but then the return is on the social system. If a cancer survivor goes back to work rather than going for early retirement or a disability pension, the return on this push on making the cancer available to work is the burden, the cost is on health, but then the return on the investment is on the welfare system and or on the labor market. So how to compensate and how to break the silos in budgeting in this case is on member states to tackle. There are some good examples in some countries, but they are not enough. So.
Nikos, really quick, last word.
Just to reinforce what Antonella and Simon were saying, the research budget of the EU constitutes only 3% of the budget of the member states. So it goes back to the member states to do this work as well. So it cannot be driven by an EU budget with 3% in research. Yeah.
Great. Okay. We're going to need to close there because it's lunchtime. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us on this panel. Really, really good discussion. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to rejoin, and we want to be back by 12:55, please. So just before 1 o'clock. So have a lunch quickly. Thank you.
Thanks for a nice